Awesome. So thanks again, all of you, for joining us today. We're going to go through a webinar, and I'm going to actually share my screen with you now. Okay. So if you'd like to just see the active speaker video in the top right corner, just click that square, that second from the left there. So you just see me, unless you want to see everyone else too. So thanks again for joining us today. Happy Passover, happy Easter to those celebrating. There are so many options for webinars right now, Instagram lives, online courses. So I'm truly humbled that you decided to join me today. It really means a lot. And I hope that you can take something valuable away from this. Whenever we discuss the body, there are so many different lenses to look at something through. So today I'm going to be discussing the hip joint, but through a specific lens, so from a specific perspective. So while that can be a little bit narrowing and limiting, I believe that this can be relevant for pretty much anyone in any situation to an extent. If you have any questions as we go through this, just put it in the chat if you'd like. At any point, Matt Lang is going to moderate some of the questions later at the end. And if we can't get it to the end for time purposes, we can address it through email or through a one-on-one call later on.
And for anybody who's just new to Zoom, if you just take your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you'll notice the chat bubble. And if you click that, you can put your questions in there. Just make sure it's set to everybody when you're sending it.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. Okay, let's get started. So we're going to spend about 30 minutes through this webinar if I stay on track. And the goals for today, I want you to have a better understanding of the function and importance of the hip joint. I want us to go through a couple different strategies as well to help you improve the health of your hip joint. Okay, so a little bit about me. For those of you who don't know me already, my name is Ryan. I am a chiropractor by profession. I've been practicing for about 4 years now. I'm going to be a dad in August, which is pretty cool. Going to join the likes of Kobe Bryant and Raj, girl dad, represent. I grew up in Thornhill, living in Toronto now. Some hobbies right now, especially in isolation, are just getting outdoors, going for a nice hike, maybe a nice run, and indoors doing some painting. Okay, so here's our session overview. I'm not going to go through each point, but what we're going to be doing is we're going to go through the first half is an educational or more of an informational component. And then in the second half, we're going to get into more of a practical component where you can go through some of the stuff that we talk about. Again, I'm going to record this webinar and post it so that you can refer back to it at a later point. But what I really want to get across now is I'm going to give you some of the strategies, and then you can use them at home. And then you can go on YouTube and search what you need to search to find the right videos to follow along with to go through some of these principles. And then we'll talk about some questions after. Okay. So some anatomy for some of you who probably haven't touched anatomy since grade school. I'm going to be really brief. We have our hip joint, which is a ball and socket joint. So that is made up of our femur, which is our thigh bone, just pointing to it with my cursor. And that femur, that thigh bone, ends on this really rounded point, okay, and connects into our acetabulum, which is just this concave surface that is attached onto our pelvic bone or our nominate bone. So that's our ball and socket joint, which is our hip. Quite stable, quite mobile. It's kind of the best of both worlds. And then on the right here, I wanted to just, again, not go into too much detail, but show you or demonstrate to you the hip capsule and the ligaments that surround the hip capsule. They surround the hip capsule in a really interesting way. They kind of work like a spiral. So when we're moving our hip joint into far end ranges of motion, the ligaments or the capsule actually tightens up and squeezes the hip joint to create even more stability. So a really cool, unique joint. The only other, I mean, the more common ball and socket joint that we think of is the shoulder, which is a lot more shallower, allowing for quite a bit more mobility, but not as much stability as the hip joint. Okay, so lots of really cool pictures of muscles on here. Again, don't want to get into too much detail. What I want you to just appreciate here is we have a lot of muscles that are coordinating movement at the hip at any time. There's no muscle that's working in isolation compared to other ones. They're all working in synchrony at different levels. And we'll talk about that too. But we have muscles that flex our hip. We have muscles that extend our hip, muscles that bring our leg out to the side, back to the middle, and rotate or twist our hip within the joint. So that leads me to talking about ranges of motion. So you can get up right now if you'd like and just go through the ranges of motion if you're more of a tactile learner. But essentially, I wanted to just go over terminology. So flexion is flexing the leg forward, flexing at the hip. Extension is moving the leg backward from the hip. Abduction is moving the leg out to the side. That's abduction. And then adduction is moving the leg back to the midline. A good way I like to remember to differentiate these two is adduction has two D's in it, and we're moving back to the middle, and the middle, or the term middle, also has two D's. So adduction, abduction. Okay, so those are some of the directions that we move our hip joint. And the last one is rotation. So I want you all, if you're sitting, to take your left foot and your left leg and straighten it out. And I want you to think of having a clock at your foot and turning your big toe to the 2 o'clock mark on a clock on your left foot. Okay, that's internal rotation. That's not actually coming from the foot itself. It's coming from the hip joint. So that's rotating at the hip, internal rotation. External rotation would be us taking our big toe and now pointing it to, let's say, 10 o'clock on the clock. Okay, so internal rotation, external rotation, that's coming from the hip itself. And then when we can combine those movements all together, we get circumduction. So no presentation is complete without a good movie reference. Chubbs Peterson definitely had it right when he was telling Happy Gilmore that it's all in the hips. The hip, if we think about the hip, is the most controllable or mobile joint connecting our body to the ground, right? So again, we can appreciate that it's a very important joint. If we think about the interconnectedness or how that hip joint relates to the rest of the body, we look at this lovely see-through dude playing soccer. The hip joint is right here, right? If we think about what's just above that joint and what's just below that joint, we see the low back or the lumbar spine and the knee. So traditionally, we think of these two joints or two regions as very stable areas, right? So if those areas require a lot of stability, they don't have a lot of movement, they usually move in one direction, back and forth, we need to have a lot of good mobility at the hip joint. So when we run into trouble is when the hip joint isn't doing enough and then the low back or the knee have to compensate. Okay. What's really important at the hip joint as we're talking about this is the idea of control of that hip joint. And that's really what we're focusing on and talking about today. So I wanted to give you a definition as it relates to what we're talking about today of control. So control is the ability for your brain to send a message through your nervous system, through your nerves, from your brain to your muscles. Your muscles need to adequately activate the right amount to perform a movement, right? So that's what we talk about motor control. It's the brain telling the muscles to do something in a proper way. So if we don't have that control, we're going to run into trouble. I'm going to pull up this super awesome video. And Matt, you're going to tell me if you can see it.
Yeah.
We're good?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
So this is Drew Storen. I am not a baseball fan, so I actually don't know who this is, but this is a really sweet video. And I'm showing this because it illustrates or highlights how important the hip joint is in some of these more complex movements that we perform. This is obviously a pretty extreme example of a pro athlete, but it's really cool to watch in slow motion. So you can see as Drew is loading up, he's rotating that back hip and he's creating tension and energy into that hip that he's going to use to move up the body into his shoulder to toss that ball. So there's a lot happening at the hip here if you pay attention to it. And as he goes through that, we then start to think about the opposite hip as it slows his body down. Right? So you can see, like, at this point, this guy has a ton of hip control, has a ton of range of motion. So this is what I think is a really good example, just illustrating how important hips are in some of these movements that we may not necessarily think the hips are important for, right? When we think of a pitcher, we think of the shoulder and the arm being important for throwing, but it really isn't the case. So I'm going to jump back into our slideshow. Are we good on this?
For those still paying attention at home, he was a Blue Jay he had a cup of tea with the Blue Jays in 2016.
Perfect.
Ryan, so
thank
you should know that. Education for everybody.
I really should. That goes to show my level of baseball knowledge. But if you ask me about basketball in the past couple of years, I could tell you a little bit more. Anyways, I digress. Some really important terminology that I want to get across for all of you in reference to what we're talking about today is differentiating between flexibility and mobility. Okay, so flexibility, the definition I'm going to give you, is the ability to lengthen a tissue passively to an end range of motion. So if you look at this girl on the right, this gymnast doing the splits, she is pushing or forcing her body into that position. She's not necessarily controlling it. She's using an external force, which is the chair and gravity, to get into that position. So that's flexibility, getting passively into an end range, okay? And we contrast that with mobility. Definition there is the ability to control or move a tissue to an end range of motion. So you're not forcing your body into this, you are actively controlling it, right? And we get back to that definition of control is your brain's ability to send a message to your nerves, into your muscle fibers, and adequately contract or activate the right amount of muscle fibers to perform a movement. And on the left here, we see this dude throwing a nice high kick, and he's actively getting his leg up there. Nothing is helping him other than his own force, okay? So flexibility, mobility. I want you to think about that as it pertains to the hip, because that's what we're talking about today. If we look at that in terms of ranges of motion or angles, our passive range is that flexibility, right? Usually further than our active range. So we can usually push our body part into a position a little bit further than we can actively put it into, right? And this is where we run into trouble, is this gap, okay? So this gap is an area where you can get a joint to that position or to that range of motion, but you can't necessarily control it. And where we run into trouble is when you're performing complex tasks or movements, if you can't control or own that gap, own that range, then you're likely putting yourselves in harm's way, right? More prone to injury in that case. So what I'm trying to get across here with this diagram is we need to close that gap. We need to get your control over your entire range of motion. So I want you to think about that information and how it relates to you. So think about some of the movements or activities or sports that you perform or play. When you get into some of those positions, do you have adequate control over those positions, right? Are you forcing yourselves into that position? So traditionally, we think about a back squat. When you go down into hip flexion, are you actively able to control that zone of hip flexion, or are you forcing yourself into it? So something else to think about as well as it relates to you. Okay, done with the boring part. Let's get practical. So before we start this, I just want to signpost that this is relevant to everyone, but not everyone may be able to perform all of this right now, okay? You may require modifications, and that's where, our virtual team comes in to help you go through some of those exercises and movements at your own pace or own level. So as we're going through this, I urge you or recommend, trying to perform this on your own, but with caution, take it slow, always listen to your body, okay? So the first part we're talking about is how do we maintain a healthy joint? How do we maintain the existing range of motion or control that we already have? So again, there's no pill, there's no fancy new product on the shopping channel that's going to do this for you. You just have to move. All right. We think about, again, that definition of control is the brain's ability to send that message to the joints, to the muscles, to move in those directions. So what we're doing is we're practicing the existing range or control that we have. And we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're packaging it in a way that you can perform this on the daily. Think of it more like a hygienic routine. So we're going to jump back into a video here. What I'm going to go through, we call these controlled articular rotations. So don't get bogged down with the terminology. We're just going to call them CARs, okay? So CARs is a way that we can take our existing range and practice that control going through the entire range of motion of our hips. So going back to here, we think about flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and rotation. We're going to try and go through all that at once. So I'm going to jump into that video. And Matt, just let me know if you can see it.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, so you can see at the start, this guy has a stable base. So he's holding on to something. You can hold on to the wall as well. And what I want you to think about here, and I'm going to talk about a little later as well, is we are only working on one joint at a time. So in this case, we're working on the hip joint. So we want to only be moving at the hip. So I'm just going to play this. And as he goes through, I want you to pay attention. And you can practice this at home. He's going to be moving the left leg, stabilizing with the right hand. Okay, so he's exploring his external rotation, which is lifting your inside ankle up to the sky. So how far can you externally rotate actively as he's going through flexion, right? So flexion is lifting your leg up to the ceiling. So we have external rotation, flexion, and he's also adducting. So adducting is moving across the midline of the body. So he's performing all these movements actively. He's controlling them. As he comes across into his end range of flexion, he's starting to move into abduction. So now he's moving away from the midline. And he's starting to rotate into internal rotation. So external was lifting the inside ankle. Now internal rotation is lifting the outside ankle to the ceiling. You can see he's twisting towards that, moving backwards into hip extension, okay? And then coming back to the starting position. What he should be doing now, which he doesn't, is he should be going back the way he came. So that's one full repetition, is going to where he is right now and then coming back the way he came would be one repetition of a hip car, okay? When you're going through these, I want you to think about how you can challenge yourself to make this easier or harder. So the way you do that is thinking about moving your leg through different viscosities, essentially. So how much force are you pushing against? Are you pushing through a tub of molasses or a pool of water, or are you just pushing through air to start, right? So those are ways that you can actively control how hard you're making this movement. And again, I want you to think about this as joint hygiene. So similar to brushing your teeth, this is the version of taking care of your joints. Okay, so these are hip cars. I hope everyone got a chance to try that. Again, I'm going to have this webinar recorded and posted. And now that you know what these are called, you can go into YouTube and search them for yourself. And I would recommend, when you're doing that, filtering videos for the past year, because things in this kind of industry have changed a little bit. So you want to have the most up-to-date videos. All right, so when you're going through these, again, just jumping back to what I said, one joint at a time. So if you're utilizing the hip joint, you're only moving at the hip, blocking everything else out by stiffening and contracting. If you cheat, you're only cheating yourself, because we're trying to work on adequate control of the hip joint itself, okay? Don't forget to breathe. Breathing is so important when we're learning a new motor skill or when we're practicing a motor skill. So make sure that you're taking good breaths and you're considering that as you're going through the movements. Last thing to think about is our brain loves to have new challenges. So while we watch this guy do hip cars standing, the brain wants to work on this in different positions. So another example of changing that up is doing the same thing on all fours. So in a quadruped or in a crawl position and going through that entire movement in that position instead. Okay, so those are CARs, controlled articular rotations. Whoa. And that's how we maintain healthy joint range of motion, the existing motion that we have. Now, we're going to talk about how we improve upon or increase our control or strength of the hip joint. So the ways that we do that are pails and rails and end range strengthening. So this is the part where when we're going through our CARs or we're going through active range of motion, we're feeling where are the sticky points? Where are the corners of our range of motion that we don't really own, right? Where's that gap that we talked about in that diagram before? This is the point where we're trying to, own those positions or those parts of our hip range of motion that we don't have control over now. So we're going to do that through pails and rails and end range strengthening. So I'm going to go through an example of that. So pails and rails is an acronym. Doesn't really matter what it stands for. What is important is the I in the pails and rails. The I stands for isometric. So isometric contraction is, imagine you're flexing your bicep and you're pushing into your arm and you're flexing, but you're not moving through space. So that's an isometric contraction, is contracting a muscle, but not moving the body part through space. So again, if we think about why we're doing this, we're trying to increase the control over a joint. And if you remember, the definition of control is the brain sending a signal to the muscle, to the tissue, to adequately activate the right amount of muscle fibers to perform that task, right? So what better way to improve that control than to send a really loud, concentrated signal to that joint or to those muscles? So that's how we do that, is through a strong isometric contraction. So I'm going to pull up this dude from the prehab guys. And I was told a couple times that I should have videos of myself going through all this. So I apologize. I will be better next time. Matt, can you see the YouTube screen?
Yep, it's pulling up.
Okay. Okay. So this guy is going to go through pails and rails of the hip. So in this case, he's starting with the right hip. His right leg is leading and his left leg is trailing. Okay, this is a 90-90 position. Again, this may be tricky for some people to get into, so you may have to work on it. You may have to hop on a virtual call with one of the foundation team to help you modify for this or figure out a way to get into this position. But this is where you would start your first pails and rails of the hip. Okay, so again, we're working on the right hip. And what I want you to think about first, the first phase of this, this drill is a stretch. So what this guy is going to do is he's going to lean over or hinge over his right thigh. Okay, I want you to hinge over your right thigh if you're trying this right now, as opposed to bend over it or fold over it. So what I mean is, if you are Iron Man and you have a chest cannon on your chest, you're going to shoot forward and you're not going to shoot your knee off. Okay, so we want to keep our chest tall and hinge over that right thigh. Okay, as you're doing that, I want you to send your right butt cheek back to the wall behind you and really start to feel that stretch is going to be in the right side of the right hip, or the outside of the right hip. And you want to feel that stretch. That's going to be you stretching the actual hip capsule. You're going to feel that kind of refer along the side of your leg. So in this pails and rails exercise, you're supposed to hold this stretch for a significant amount of time. Usually they say about 2 minutes. Okay, so that's the first component of this pails rails. Holding that stretch, feeling that good stretch in the hip for 2 minutes. Okay, we're trying to change the architecture of the tissue in the hip joint. After that 2 minutes is up, or that significant amount of time is up, what you're going to do is you're going to start to gradually ramp up an isometric contraction. So remember, you're not moving the body part through space, you're just contracting that muscle very hard into external rotation. So if you remember, that's pushing your outside ankle of your right foot into the ground. So this guy's starting to push, and he's gradually ramping up to 100%. So with all his might, he's pushing that right outside ankle into the ground, keeping the rest of his leg in the same position. And he's ramping up to 100%. So everything he's got, he's pushing that right ankle down to the ground for about 10 to 15 seconds, okay? So that's the second piece of this first repetition of the exercise. Stretch, isometric contraction, pushing the outside right ankle down into the ground as hard as you can, ramping it up 10 to 15 seconds, okay? As soon as that time's up, you are now switching the direction of the contraction. So you're taking the inside right ankle and trying to drive it up to the sky. But remember, you don't have to move through space. You just have to actively contract, right? Your brain needs to send that message to the joint, and that's how it's doing it. You don't need to worry about actually moving through space. It's the intent and the activation that's important, okay? So he's doing the same thing. He's now ramping up that contraction, inside ankle to the sky, for 10 to 15 seconds, okay? Giving it all he's got, and then stop, and you repeat that all again, okay? So it takes a little bit of time, but you're gonna go through the stretch, go through the first contraction, 10 to 15 seconds, the second contraction, and then you're gonna dive a little bit deeper into the stretch if you can, and repeat what we just went through. For beginners, again, there's no formula for this, but I would go through this, 3 to 4 times for your first time, and then you would switch to the left leg.
Hey, Ryan, if I can just interrupt you for a quick second. We have a question from Pearl, and she's just wondering, when she's doing the stretch, she's feeling it mostly in her glute, and she's wondering if she's doing something wrong, or is that just a different place that some clients might feel that stretch?
No, that's perfect. So a good point about stretching is everyone's going to be a little bit different, right? Just depending on your body, how you use it, how it's set up. Everyone's going to feel this stretch a little bit differently. So that glute stretch that you're feeling, Pearl, is likely still that joint capsule, but you may just be feeling it at a different point than you'd think. You want to find where that stretch is for you. So when you're diving or hinging over your leg, I want you to think about maybe changing the position or the direction that you're facing. So maybe you're taking your head and you're pointing it to 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock or 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, finding wherever that stretch is for you, because it's going to be different for everyone.
And now, Ryan, is there like an easy modification for people to do with this stretch? I know this is, I'm not a beginner with this stretch, but years of playing hockey have given me awful hips.
Yeah.
So I typically won't do this one without a yoga block underneath my hips to try to even attempt this. Is there a way to know we should be using it, or if these guys are at home trying this exercise, is there a kind of a rhyme or reason to when you would suggest using a yoga block or some sort of support?
Yeah, I would say if you're having trouble getting into that position, right? Because this requires some hip rotation to begin with to get into that 90-90, which not a lot of people have, just the way we use our bodies. So if you're having trouble getting into that, you're getting pinching, you're getting pain, I would first recommend talking to someone like me or Matt or Raj or someone on the team about it. But yeah, one modification that a lot of people will use is sticking a yoga block under the bum to elevate and allow for you to have less rotation at that lead leg, at that hip. Another thing that you can do is using like a couch or a big box at the gym, which we don't really have access to now, to lunge onto it, or actually be standing and put that leg on top of the box or on top of the couch, so that you're elevated a bit more and you're not putting so much stress on the hip joint. But again, this is going to be a case-by-case basis. It's going to be a little bit tricky to recommend one thing for someone and not for the other. So again, if you're having trouble with this, I would definitely hop on a call with someone, and then they can kind of walk you through what the best way for you to perform this. Sound good? Okay. So pails and rails, improving our existing control, right? We're trying to send a really loud, concentrated signal to the hip joint right now. Another way that we do that is end range liftoffs. So I'm not going to go through any videos with you. I'm just going to show some photo examples, because this is a really cool way. Like, this is a way that you can get quite creative with the way you set this up. And again, because we're stuck at home, you can kind of MacGyver and set things up to be the best for you. You can use lots of household items to set some of these positions up. But essentially what we're doing is we're holding our end range position, right? And then coming back to that idea that we're working at one joint at a time. If we see this first video or this first photo on the left here, this gentleman is working on end range hip extension. So he's taking his knee, he had it on that yoga block, and now he's lifting it off, but he's only moving at the hip. So you can see his hands here to try and support his torso, so that he doesn't compensate at the low back, at the lumbar spine, or at the spine at all. And the ball in here is to help recruit more hip extension muscles, because our hamstring muscles, without getting into too much detail, cross the knee joint. So by doing this, he's getting a greater recruitment or greater activation of the muscles that extend at the hip, okay? There's no formula for this. I can't say, go home, do this for 5 seconds, 10 reps, 3 sets. It's not going to work, because everyone's different, right? So what I'd recommend always is starting small, starting slow. I would periodize this in a way where you're doing shorter holds and maybe more repetitions. And then I would start to tip the scale the other way as you're getting more comfortable with these ideas and these positions. Okay, so this is an example of someone setting up an end range liftoff for hip extension, right? So sending the hip backwards. This is an example of a gentleman setting up end range liftoff for hip flexion, right? So he's going to lift his foot off this tabletop at some point and do an active hold for a certain period of time until he fatigues, and then come back down and set up for a next repetition, okay? The idea here is we're sending that really loud isometric signal to the joint, to the muscles, to practice that control at our end range. We're trying to close that gap. Okay.
Ryan, we got another great question this time from
absolutely.
Russell. And he asked, does activating the hamstrings at the knee preferentially recruit the glutes at the hip?
So the premise that we're going through here is, I want you to think less about the muscles in isolation. I want you to think about the groups of muscles that we're working here. So when we're going through hip extension, we're thinking about sending the loudest signal we can. So we're trying to recruit any of the muscles that perform hip extension in this position, because again, like I said, there's no one muscle that's going to work on its own to pull you through a movement. Your body doesn't know what your muscles are called. It doesn't know how they work in isolation. It's going to do what it needs to do to send that signal to actively recruit the right amount of muscle fibers to perform that movement. So all he's doing here is he's amplifying that signal that the brain is sending, right? Because if the hamstrings, though they cross two joints, without getting too technical, they cross the hip joint and the knee joint. So all we're doing here is we're creating a stronger activation of all the muscles that extend the hip. I hope that makes sense. So we're not picking one over the other. We're just trying to get all the muscles on board that extend at the hip. Is that okay, Matt?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And just before you move on, Bianca wants to know, how do you assess hip joint control to know which specific pail or rail to do?
Okay, great question. What I would say is the pails and rails that we talked about over here are mainly focused on rotation. So without getting into too much detail, rotation is going to be the range of motion where all of us have the most trouble in, And it's the range of motion that improving upon translates the best to all other ranges of motion. So flexing at the hip, extending at the hip, right? Because most of the things that we do with our hip are combined movements. So whenever we're flexing and extending, there's always some sort of rotation going on. So if you think about that ball and socket joint and the capsule that surrounds it, that capsule over time gets very fibrotic and kind of gunky, right? So when we work on rotation, we're working on freeing up that joint capsule. So rotation is always going to be the best place to start with a pails and rails. Okay, and again, like without going overboard and going into other progressions, I want to just start with the basics. And again, if you have any questions, we can hop on a call at a later point and go into more detail, but rotation is going to be the point that everyone needs to start at. Cool? Okay. Just wanted to go through a couple more setups because again, coming back to these liftoffs, you can get creative with them at home, especially now that we are stuck at home. There's some creative ways to go through some of these liftoffs. This is another example of a gentleman going through hip extension and range liftoffs, right? So he's going to focus on only moving at the hip joint here by driving his heel up to the ceiling, holding that contraction for X amount of time as figured by his level of fatigue and his level of fitness, and then going through some repetitions for that. This gentleman on the right is going through, in that 90 position that we started at, is going through an internal rotation liftoff. So he's taking his trail leg, his back leg, and lifting the inside ankle off the ground. Okay, so this is an example of an end range liftoff for controlling internal rotation. All right, so lots of different ways to set this up. And again, this is the time where you could go on YouTube and look at different ideas just by typing in end range liftoffs, hip, flexion, extension, rotation. There's so much stuff out there that you can check out and get some ideas on how to go about that. Okay, so we're getting a little bit overboard, so I want to keep this succinct and on track. Last kind of words of caution is this stuff is hard. Okay, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You will cramp. Again, cramping is the brain's way of telling the body that it's not ready fully to complete this task. It's having trouble activating the right amount of muscles, so it's going into a lockdown mode. So when you're doing this, when you're going through pails and rails, end range liftoffs, know that cramping is okay. It's going to happen. But you don't want to work through the cramps. If you're getting a cramp, stop, reset, give yourself a break, go back into it. Don't be afraid to challenge the nervous system, challenge the body a little bit, because it needs that. That's the only way it's going to learn. All right. You'll be sore from this. You'd be surprised at how, like, it looks like you're doing very little, but the next day you'll be like, oh my God, I'm more sore than when I did like a CrossFit class. Again, it's the good sore, it's not the bad sore. But just keep that in mind and consider that when you're going through this stuff. And again, this will be hard, but it is very high yield. This is the stuff that you're going to work on, especially right now because we're in isolation and we're not able to do a lot of the activities or sports that we usually do. This is going to be the time where you can work on this joint control, and you'll be surprised at how well it translates to some of the movements that you're going to perform. Again, it may be a little bit subjective. We may not be able to quantify it as much, but working through this after a month or two and then going back to certain movements in sports and being like, oh my God, my hip is so much more open. Like I have so much more control, such a better feeling in some of those joints. So something to consider, especially now that we have a lot of time on our hands working on this stuff. Okay. That's it. That's all I got for today. I wanted to keep it short. I wanted to keep your attention spans because I know it can be tough to go over, 35, 40 minutes. I just wanted to give some thanks to the functional anatomy guys. So that's the umbrella that FRC falls under. And this is what a lot of the principles that I talked about fall under. A group of chiros in Toronto, Dr. Spina, Dr. Chivers, some awesome stuff. They've created some great protocols and ways to work on some of this joint control. And of course, Foundation Physio team for hosting the webinar. Matt, Raj, Carlin, Alex, thank you so much. Best mentors. And that's it, guys. We'll take some more questions now. I'm sure we have a lot of them just looking at the chat number. So we'll try and get to a few now. But again, here's my contact information. If we don't get to your question, I still really want to answer it. So send me an email, send me a message on Instagram. I'm going to load this webinar, hopefully, if I can figure it out, onto my website. And feel free to visit that at any point if you want to go back to some of the things that I talked about today. And yeah, I would love to see if you guys were starting to try some of these cars and pails and rails and liftoffs. If you are Instagram savvy and you want to post onto your story, tag me. I would love to see that. It would make my day, make my week. So feel free to do that. And my information's right here. Okay, Matt.
There was a great question. So everybody's just typing in, thanks, Ryan. There was
my absolute pleasure.
Shakira would be proud of you, but there was an actual question.
Hips do not lie.
Oh gosh, there was a great question in here somewhere that I missed. Pearl, I can answer this one for you. What does a virtual session look like through Foundation?
Yes, great question.
That's a really great question because I think everybody considers, physiotherapy, chiropractic, massage, all kind of in-clinic, hands-on type of thing. But I think, Ryan, you'd agree with me, really what we do is we educate people, and our skill is in assessing what's going on. So they're all done over web-based systems, depending on what you guys have. We've been using Google Hangouts or Zoom right now. Usually the therapist is going to guide you through a series of screening movements, just like Ryan went through with you guys today. And based on how you guys move, how you guys respond, we're going to be in constant contact about where do you feel tightness, where do you feel pain, does something hurt? That's going to help us guide you with the exercises we're going to give you and the education, and the home exercise you're going to then work on. So it's really us being able to see you guys do the screening tool just like you would do in a normal clinical scenario. We're just doing it online.
Yeah, great.
And Pearl just asked again, are insurance providers accepting them? Yes, for the most part. I don't know if you can unmute Raj there, Ryan. He might be able to answer this better than I can, but I think I've seen about at least 80% of the insurance companies are approving online virtual sessions. And the ones that have not denied them. It's been, it's just a matter of the companies getting around to rewriting some of their bylaws. Now I'm missing who asked this question, but somebody did ask you, Ryan, should they be doing these exercises every day?
Yeah, I mean, I would say hip cars, right? If we're thinking about that as like a hygiene, a maintenance type movement, these are things that you want to do every day. Definitely every day. The pails and rails, you're gonna have to listen to your body with those liftoffs, because you may be sore, you may need some time for recovery. Recovery is always important when you talk about this stuff. So it's gonna be tricky, but you really you got to listen to your body and see how it's responding to the input that you're providing it.
Bianca would like to know if cars are applicable to other joints like the shoulder.
Absolutely. Yeah. So again, just in keeping this kind of succinct and short, we're just talking about the hip today, but that stuff is applicable for any synovial joint. So any joint that allows you to move a part of your body through space, you're going to be able to do a controlled rotation through it, right? So, if you'd like, hop onto YouTube, literally just substitute hip for any part of the body and write cars and see what people have come up with. There's a lot of creativity out there. Yeah.
Great. Raj said, if you do have any other questions, give your boy Ryan a shout.
Yes. Yeah. Please.
He's better than YouTube. That's for Raj.
Yeah. Take a screenshot of my contact info if we aren't connected already, and feel free to reach out at any point. I am my schedule is open. Yeah. Good.
Great. Does anybody have any last minute questions about the hip or some of those exercises or protocols? Getting a couple more thank yous.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so
There we
much
go.
for joining. Really appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Ryan.
just
That
like
was super helpful.
Yeah, my
Thanks
pleasure.
so much,
Amazing.
Ryan. That was great. That was a
Thanks
great
again,
first
guys.
webinar for our team.
And again, reach out if you have any questions. Okay.
And if there's any feedback from the audience,
Yes.
please do email Ryan as well.
Yeah, I would love to hear that.
Positive as well as constructive. We'd love
Yeah.
to hear how we can do better to serve our community. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much again, and have a great long weekend, though. I mean, all weeks are long now. Okay, take care, guys.